everyone. Welcome to another episode of Island Uplift's history class. It is so good to have you. In today's episode, we will be looking at the topic, the Spanish conquest, and specifically we'll be looking at the different areas in the Caribbean region that the Spanish would have conquered, specifically within the Caribbean islands. Now, for this topic, our objectives are that we must understand the Spanish policy towards the indigenous people. We will be looking at Nicolas de Ovando and the Conquest of Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. We will also be looking at Diego Columbus and the Conquest of Jamaica, Cuba, and the Yucatan Peninsula. We will take a look at the genocide of the Taino, the role of the church in all of this, Bartholomew de las Casas, which will be included in the part, the role of the church. And of course, we will look at completing the conquest of the Caribbean region. So let's get into it. Now, on May the 4th, 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull or a papal declaration, which was called Inter Caetera, meaning among other works. And this declaration gave the lands that were discovered by Christopher Columbus to the Spanish crown, primarily to Queen Isabella. Now, the lands were declared by the Pope as the personal property of Queen Isabella. Now, this, of course, although it sounded regal and it sounded good, this ignored any rights or sovereignty that the Taino and the Kalinago people would have had, who occupied those lands years and even in some cases many years before the Europeans arrived. Now, Queen Isabella had the intention of treating the indigenous people with respect, looking out for their well-being and development, with the overall aim of encouraging them to adopt the Christian faith. People who ill-treated them were even to be punished. That was the ideal perspective. However, despite the Queen's good intentions, others thought and acted differently. We saw, for example, and we will see, for example, characters such as her husband, King Ferdinand. We already saw the impact of Christopher Columbus, and we will even see the impact of a man by the name of Archbishop Juan de Fonseca, and we were introduced to him already, and you can look at episode 6 to remember that, because he was the royal chaplain of the king and the queen. Now, during the reign and even after the death of Queen Isabella, these men, along with others, would play major roles in setting the pace for Spanish conquest and the establishing of the Spanish policy in the Caribbean region and the Americas. So let's get into it. So the year is 1500, and a man by the name of Francisco de Bobadilla, he is entering into the Caribbean region. Francisco de Bobadilla. You see, Francesco, he was sent by the Queen Isabella to investigate complaints that were made concerning Christopher Columbus's administration. And to be reminded of this, you could check out episode 6, which highlights the voyages of Christopher Columbus. And he was also there to investigate an open series of rebellions that were carried out by a man named Francisco Roldan. And Roldan was carrying out these revolts since 1498. Now, Roldan, he was a colonist and he came with Columbus on one of his previous voyages. Now, Bobadilla arrested Columbus in September 1500, and we would have dealt with this in episode 6 already. And he arrested Columbus on charges of maladministration, which you can agree with because Columbus really didn't do such a good job at bringing proper not just development, but administrative development into the territory of Hispaniola. And by the way, we're speaking about Hispaniola now, right? This is the context of Hispaniola. Now, this arrest brought an end to Columbus's third voyage, and we definitely would remember that. Then Bobadilla, here's how things going to flip around now. Bobadilla took on the role of governing Hispaniola, but he himself became a poor governor. His poor governance was seen in his preferential treatment of European settlers on the island, and that allowed the European settlers to ill-treat the local indigenous people. Bobadilla also withheld from sending the required quota of gold to the Spanish crown. As a matter of fact, I think they were supposed to send about half of the gold that they found back to the crown. Bobadilla refrained from doing that. Now, 2 years later, in the year 1502, we see another man entering into the scene, a man by the name of Nicholas de Ovando. And this man is going to, his administration is going to set off a series of events that are going to transform Caribbean history forever. Nicholas de Ovando, he was sent by Juan de Fonseca, and Fonseca was a man who orchestrated the arrest of Columbus, so we would have remembered that. Now, Ovando, he was a military commander who fought in the war against the Moors in Granada. And remember in episode 5, we would have mentioned and spoke about the war against the Moors in the province of Granada in southern Spain, which ended in 1492, which was the same year that Christopher Columbus set sail on his first voyage. Now, Ovando, 10 years later in 1502, Ovando set sail for Hispaniola with 30 ships and 2,500 settlers. To that date, this was the largest armada or the largest group of ships that ever, at that moment, traveled to the Caribbean at one point in time, at one time rather. So all of these ships traveled and they were headed straight for Hispaniola, and Ovando meant business because Columbus messed up the situation. Bobadilla messed up the situation, and Ovando had to be the man now who had to go in and clean everything up and bring some structure. All right. Now we see here, we are now in Hispaniola. And after arriving in Hispaniola, Ovando immediately arrested Bobadilla and Roldan. Remember, Roldan was the guy who was causing riots and so on since 1498. Now, both men were expelled from the island along with any other troublesome colonists. Now, here's the thing. Ovando made, and this is a mistake Columbus made, or maybe it was deliberate action. Ovando made the assumption that the indigenous people were in revolt as well. So he decided to deal with the indigenous people harshly. Oh my Lord. And we see exactly what is gonna happen here. So Ovando traveled to the province of Jaragua, which was in southwest Hispaniola, and there he met a female cacique by the name of Anacaona. And Anacaona, she was actually the widow of Caonabo. Now remember, we spoke about Caonabo in episode 6 when we were highlighting the voyages of Christopher Columbus. And Anacaona, she was the chieftainess, or sometimes she was even referred to as the queen. She invited Ovando to a feast. She didn't come up against him in any war some way or anything. She wanted peace. So she invited him to a feast that they were having. And the feast was going to be attended by 40 sub-chiefs in the Taino group in Jaragua. Now, during the feast, Ovando did something absolutely horrific. Ovando gave a signal to his men and caused his men to kill all 40 of the sub-chiefs that were there, and then they arrested Anacaona. Now, 1 year later in 1503, she was hanged in Santo Domingo. Absolutely tragic. And this was now going to set off a series of events that were just going to bring absolute tragedy. Even when the Spanish were conquering, it was just going to be one massive tragic story. Ovando then sent one of his men, Juan de Esquivel, to the Higüey province, and you can see the Higüey province there on the map. And Esquivel and his men, they went there and they overcame the Taino men there, but Esquivel and his men used horses and bloodhound dogs in absolutely vicious style. Now, the cacique of that province, the chief cacique, was a guy by the name of Chief Cotubanama. He was hanged by Esquivel. And then the Taino in that province who were not killed, they were tortured and were placed into forced labor. Oh my Lord. Oh my Lord. Now, Ovando's treatment of the Taino was so cruel that a labor shortage of Taino people, it was created on the island. And as a result, he began importing Lucayan Taino to fill the labor gap. These are the Taino groups that lived in the Bahamas Islands. Now, the Lucayan Taino, they were forced to work in mines and they were forced to also dive for pearls. And as a result, many of them died from being overworked, and many of them even died from committing suicide because they were saying, listen, it's better that I kill myself than live in this kind of condition. You see, Ovando was known to attempt justifying his actions, and here's how he justified his actions. He stated that it was his way of converting the indigenous people to Christianity. However, just like those before him, you know exactly what happened. His aim was not conversion or spreading a religious message. His aim was purely conquest and accumulation of resources, especially the coveted resource known as gold. Now, in understanding how Ovando would have gone about doing his conquest and doing his crazy administrative duties, it is very important for us to remember or understand the repartimiento system and the encomienda system. Now, if you want to be reminded of these systems, I would encourage you to go back to episode 7, where we looked at the impact of the indigenous people and the Europeans on each other. So the encomienda system, it started to expand greatly in Hispaniola because it was made legal in 1503. Now, the original intended principles of the system were ignored because remember, if you look back at episode 7, the indigenous people were really supposed to be paid. However, that did not happen, and it actually transformed into a forced labor system. And as we mentioned before, Hispaniola was suffering a huge labor crisis due to the extermination, the overworking, and the suicide of many of the indigenous people. And this was then further heightened by the influx of Spaniards that began settling in Hispaniola, because check it out. In the year 1502, when Ovando arrived in Hispaniola, there were about 300 Spanish settlers there. By the year 1506, just 4 years later, there were over 12,000 Spanish settlers. You see, Ovando had begun carrying out this radical colonization effort throughout all of Hispaniola. He wanted Hispaniola to practically be a representative of Spain, like a second Spain. So he carried out some radical things. And here are some of the steps that Governor Ovando took in colonizing Hispaniola. Firstly, troublemakers were expelled, making Hispaniola a more law-abiding place. Policies of exclusivism were relaxed, and it allowed Jews and conversos, among others, to settle on the island, along with the traditional Castilians. Spanish settlers, they came as they were promised their own house and land. If men who came were unmarried, they were encouraged to marry Taino women. And if the men who came were married, they were encouraged to bring their wives. So they made it a family affair. They said, listen, you could bring your family, set up shop in Hispaniola. It's going to be great. We have proper organization now. Come. So a lot of people were making the move. Then the city of Santo Domingo was developed, and it became a central hub. And for about 50 years, it became the capital city of the Spanish Empire in the New World. Then, despite initial deaths due to diseases, in particular fevers and so on, there was a frequent influx of persons, and this allowed repopulation to be a very swift process. So people were coming. Then there were cattle, horses, sheep, and pigs, and they were introduced and they were used throughout the island. The livestock flourished because there was a lack of diseases, especially cattle-based diseases and so on. There was also an open range system of agriculture that was developed and was adopted. Although, being honest with you, this was a bit wasteful because what happened in this open range system, the Spanish would have allocated circular shaped plots of land. Now, I want you to imagine yourself, imagine putting a bunch of circles together, you'd realize that there's spaces in between them. So even though it wanted to bring about a sense of equality in land allocation, it really caused a lot of land wastage as well. But nevertheless, it was their system of agricultural development. Now, the use of livestock made Hispaniola a central area for meat production, such as beef, pork, and mutton. Horse breeding also became a big thing. It became very profitable, and it was a profitable income generator because people needed horses, whether to work, whether for leisure, and especially in warfare, they needed horses. There was also a big industry that rose up in candle production because the animal fat, when they sold the meat, they used the fat now to make candles. Innovative, all right? There was also different crops that were brought in from other countries. Rice was brought in from China. Figs, oranges, and lemons were brought in from Spain. Bananas were brought in from the Canary Islands, and they grew well in the region. Now, there were some other crops they tried, such as grapes and apples and so on, that didn't thrive so well, but these other crops thrived well. They also depended on the local indigenous crops, such as yams, cassava, and tobacco, for their daily food requirements. So they definitely used these crops very often on a daily basis. Now, interestingly, to curb the labor issue, and this is an interesting story, to curb the labor issue that was created by the diminishing indigenous populace, Ovando did something extreme. Ovando ordered the importation of the first ever cohort of Spanish-speaking Black African slaves who were called Black Ladinos. Now, this is actually one of the first recorded cases of Africans being used in the New World as slaves, even before the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade itself. And this is really sad because a lot of these Black Ladinos, they would have been men who were captured during the Arab slave trade. They also would have been men who were captured. You remember in episode 5, we're talking about the Portuguese, and when they explored the western coast of Africa, they captured slaves. So it was the first instance of Black men being used as slaves in European society. Well, a lot of these men, they became what we call Hispanicized. A lot of the African men became Hispanicized, meaning they learned to speak Spanish, they learned the culture, and of course, they were adapting the religion and so on. So a lot of them were sent over now by request of Ovando to work in the forced labor system that they had there. There's reports, of course, of a lot of these men rising up with the indigenous peoples in revolt against the Spanish, all right? It's a pretty interesting topic to explore, and I would encourage you definitely, when you have the time, to explore it more about the Black Ladinos. Then there was the big one, what I believe to be the primary reason why the Spanish went there in the first place. And at first, it was to look for spices and so on, but gold was the thing. Gold was the thing. The Spanish crown wanted an increase in the production of gold. I remember that was one of their 3 primary objectives for exploration: God, gold, and glory. Although, being honest with you, there was more emphasis on the gold and the glory than God, right? The crown had passed a law in 1501, before Ovando's arrival, that half, remember I mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, that half of the gold found in the mine should be sent to the crown. Now, Bobadilla and other settlers at the time found it difficult to meet such a demand, and a lot of times they refrained from sending that. Now, Ovando in 1502, upon his arrival, he was successful in getting that law changed. And they changed it, instead of 50%, they said, okay, send 1/5, 20% of the gold. So 20% of the gold that you mine, it should be sent to the crown. As a result, people say, yeah, this is good. We could work with this. So it stimulated increased gold production. Wow. Now, gold was originally harvested as alluvial gold. This means that those men would have gone to rivers and they would have collected gold that was washed down in the river stream. However, settlers then went into applying for licenses to mine gold. So even independent settlers had their own mines, and they had licenses to establish their own mines where they could obtain the gold. And for a time, although it did not outshine revenue made by meat production, ranching, and agricultural produce, gold production in Hispaniola created a great revenue stream for the Spanish crown. So we realize now that Hispaniola was officially conquered by the Spanish. Hispaniola was officially conquered by the Spanish. But guess what? They didn't want to stay there. They didn't want to stay there. Attention now began focusing on a nearby island that the Taino called Borinquen, but what the Spanish would eventually call Puerto Rico. Now, the conquest of Puerto Rico, the motives for the conquest of Puerto Rico wasn't to curb any shortage in labor or any shortage in land. All right, that was not the case. Instead, it could be seen that the motivation to conquer Puerto Rico, it was based on a desire for more gold and a thirst for adventure. They wanted more gold, and these men, they're conquistadors. They want to explore, they want to conquer. It's a thirst for adventure for them. So in 1508, Ovando gave permission to a man named Juan Ponce de Leon, and de Leon was the one who actually requested it, by the way, to lead the colonization effort on Borinquen. Now, the Spanish crown had initially commissioned Vicente Pinzon, who was the man who captured the Nina during Columbus's first voyage. The Spanish crown had actually commissioned him to colonize the island in the year 1505, but by 1507, Pinzon failed to do so. So the idea was scrapped, and that gave way for Ponce de Leon to do his thing. Now, Ponce de Leon, he had arrived in the New World during Columbus's second voyage in 1493. So he had about 15 years experience in fighting with the Taino. So we understand now that Ponce de Leon, he's getting ready to explore and potentially conquer Puerto Rico. And he arrived in San Juan Bay, which is in the modern capital city of San Juan, Puerto Rico, in July 1508, with one ship that was crewed by 50 men. Ponce de Leon and his men then ventured about 2 miles in from San Juan Bay, right? Ponce de Leon and his men then ventured about 2 miles in from San Juan Bay until they found a place that they began developing a settlement on. They called the settlement Puerto Rico, meaning rich port. Now, Ponce de Leon would go on to carry out various expeditions and conquests throughout the island of San Juan Bautista. That was the actual name that they called Puerto Rico, San Juan Bautista. And of course, it was later changed to Puerto Rico. So instead of calling the entire island San Juan, they call the city San Juan, and they call the entire island Puerto Rico eventually. And Ponce de Leon would have even conducted voyages to Florida. Now, many of you may or may not know this, but Ponce de Leon's story is what brought about the famed myth or the famed legend of the Fountain of Youth. And this is something we could look at. This is an interesting thing to look at in maybe a future episodes. But by 1509, Ponce de Leon's voyage to Puerto Rico was seen as a success, and he and his crew acquired so much gold and they were victorious in many battles against the Taino. However, the battles with the Taino to the east of the island proved difficult, as these Tainos were fiercer than others due to their constant conflict with the Kalinago. So Ponce de Leon really didn't have that easy of a time conquering Puerto Rico, but he eventually got through. So both Hispaniola and San Juan Bautista or Puerto Rico were now under Spanish rule, but they didn't stop there. They didn't stop there. In 1508, while Ponce de Leon was in Puerto Rico, Nicholas Ovando was granted permission to retire from his post as governor of Hispaniola. He wanted to retire. Then in 1509, a year later, Diego Columbus, who was the eldest son of Christopher Columbus, succeeded Ovando as governor of Hispaniola. Now, Diego stayed in that position until the year 1520, and then he served as viceroy of the Spanish Indies until 1523. Now, the year 1509, Diego Columbus sent Juan de Esquivel. Remember Juan de Esquivel? He had conquered the province of Higüey and Hispaniola. Diego Columbus sent Juan de Esquivel with 700 settlers to conquer the island of Jamaica, which we know today as modern-day Jamaica. Now, he wanted to capture the land before many of his competitors did. as he was already not in approval by the crown. Now, the crown had to appoint him governor because a court order that was passed, and the court order was passed in agreement with promises that were made to his father, Christopher Columbus, when Christopher Columbus was alive. So legally, they had to put Diego Columbus there as governor. So in the year 1509, Esquivel and his men traveled to Jamaica, and they didn't really encounter any great level of opposition. You see, the local Taino, they didn't give much of a resistance to Esquivel and his men, and as a result, Esquivel and his men, they were able to establish a settlement very quickly. Now, they named the settlement Sevilla La Nueva, which meant New Seville, and it's located in the St. Anne's Bay area. However, Seville was eventually abandoned, and a new settlement was established called Villa de la Vega in modern-day Spanish Town. Now, Villa de la Vega became the official capital city of the island in the year 1534. Now, interestingly, because no gold was found on Jamaica, many Spanish settlers did not take up residence there at first. The island was also seen as not being as strategically important as Cuba or Puerto Rico. And you see, it was primarily used to supply Hispaniola with foodstuff and native cotton goods like hammocks and so on. And ships were also supplied with meat, animal hides, and tallows from cattle. So the island at first gave a lot of supplies, but it was not seen as significant at the time. It wasn't seen as significant as Hispaniola or even as Puerto Rico and Cuba, because Puerto Rico and Cuba were seen as more strategic locations towards the Spanish Empire's cause. So for them, it was easy work, and they eventually conquered Jamaica. Then in the year 1508, an explorer by the name of Sebastian de Ocampo, he had explored the entire coastline of Cuba, and it took about 8 months to do this. And this motivated the Spanish even more to explore the idea of conquering and colonizing Cuba. Because remember, at first, it took them a while to realize that Cuba was actually an island. If it took them a while to realize that Jamaica was an island, imagine how long it took them to realize, wait, we're not even a continent here. This is an island. It's a big island. So 3 years later, in the year 1511, Diego Columbus sent Diego Velazquez to conquer the island. Now, Diego Velazquez, he conquered the island easily due to the peaceful nature of the Taino. However, he also orchestrated the senseless slaughtering of many of those Taino people. Absolutely senseless. So in 1512, Velazquez founded the town of Baracoa in southeastern Cuba. Then in 1514, he founded the towns of Bayamo and Santiago is today known as Santiago de Cuba. And then in the year 1519, Velazquez founded the city of Havana. Now, the initial purpose of the city of Havana was to act as a final port of call for ships leaving the Caribbean region for Europe, and later on to be that strategic meeting and resource and restocking point between the Caribbean and even the Americas, like North America. However, by the year 1550, Havana became the capital city of the Spanish Indies, taken over from Santo Domingo. All right. Now, Velazquez would have been able to overcome most of the resistance from the Taino. However, his greatest challenge was from a Taino cacique by the name of Hatui. And this is a very interesting guy to look up. So I would encourage you to look up more on the cacique chief Hatui and his resistance against the Spanish in Cuba. So we see here now that the Spanish have conquered Hispaniola. They've conquered Puerto Rico. They've conquered Jamaica. And they've conquered Cuba. Then in the year 1590, the same year that Havana was established, Velazquez sent a military commander by the name of Hernan Cortes to explore and conquer the Yucatan Peninsula in Central America. Now, I'm not going to venture into this, but I'm going to show you exactly what we're going to do with this, because a lot of things happen with Hernan Cortes' exploration of the Yucatan Peninsula. And we definitely have to look at this. So I'm going to show you something at the end of the episode. All right, so let's be patient for it. Now, Trinidad was the last island in the Caribbean region that was successfully conquered and colonized by the Spanish. By 1511, indigenous peoples were used as slaves by the Spanish to dive for pearls off the coast of Isla Margarita, which is off the coast of Venezuela. Now, on November 8, 1530, Antonio Cedeno, he arrives at the Bay of Erin on Trinidad, which is today known as Erin Bay, after traveling from Cadiz, Spain, with 2 ships and 70 men in total. Now, before arriving, he was already, and this is weird because they didn't really officially capture the island, but before arriving, Cedeno was already appointed as governor or captain general of Trinidad on July 12, 1530, before arriving. That's interesting. Anyway, now at first, Cedeno and the local indigenous people, they had a good relationship, but food supplies became low. And of course, the Spanish wanted more and more. So what they did, instead of negotiating with the local indigenous people, they exploited them, they ill-treated them. However, the island was not properly settled until the year 1592, when Domingo de Vera, he conquered the indigenous people and established the town of San Josef de Oruna, which later became known as St. Joseph, and that became known as the first capital city of the island of Trinidad. So right here now, we see that the Spanish have conquered Hispaniola, they've conquered Puerto Rico, they've conquered Jamaica, they've conquered Cuba, and now they've conquered Trinidad. Wow. Now, if you notice, the Spanish did not conquer the smaller islands. They would have explored them, but they didn't conquer them. And I think many of us will know why. Because the Kalinago people groups, well, first of all, there are various reasons. The terrain of these islands were very mountainous, so it would have been difficult to really capture them, conquer them, make them into viable agricultural producers and so on, although they are viable agricultural producers, but at the time it would have been seen as difficult. But the biggest reason is the Kalinago people. You see, the Kalinago people, they resisted the Spanish and they resisted Europeans in general quite well. They were very organized in their warfare, and they were able to be very successful in their resistance. It's quite amazing, quite amazing. So anyway, these major land masses are now captured by the Spanish, and they're now part of the developing Spanish Empire. They were even known as the Spanish Indies. Now, throughout the entire process of the Spanish conquering the larger islands of the Caribbean region, many Taino and many indigenous people died. And this is a part that really hurts my heart. And I'm not just saying so because of the video. It really hurts my heart when I read it. They died during conflicts with the Spanish from being overworked and from committing suicide. So why did the Spaniards resort to killing so many Taino? That's a good question to ask. Why? Well, firstly, many of the Spaniards were soldiers who were released from fighting the Moors in the year 1492. They were used to bearing arms, and they were extremely proficient in their weaponry, along with having a taste for adventure. Secondly, they only wanted gold, and they expected the Taino to provide them with food. As a result, they treated the Taino like slaves and killed them if they would not cooperate. Wow. Many of the settlers came in 1498, and many of them were criminals who were unlikely to show concern for the native population. Then the Spanish adopted what we call a Hidalgo class attitude. Now, this meant that they pursued land ownership, but they shunned actually doing manual work. So they would have also hunted the Taino for sport. Wow. And then there were priests and clergymen who did not restrain settlers, not all of them, but many of them did not restrain settlers from treating the Taino badly. As a result, the ill treatment might have been seen as divinely justified by many. So even many of the priests and clergymen were even seen as condoners of what the Spaniards were doing. And then, of course, many of the Spaniards came without wives. So therefore, when they took the local Taino women, they would have clashed with the Taino men, which would have obviously caused conflict. Now, the Spanish, they were more advanced in their weaponry. They had guns and swords. The Taino men had bows and arrows. So obviously, it was much easier. It was a much easier process for the Spanish to overcome the Taino men than for it to happen the other way. Now, ways in which the Taino were killed, and this one is sad. This one is sad. I mean, we have to go through it. It's required, but this is sad. Ways in which the Taino were killed. First of all, the use of bloodhound dogs. Bloodhound dogs. Now, dogs were seen as being very effective, and they were seen as being worth as much as 10 soldiers. One dog was seen as being worth as much as 10 soldiers against the Taino. So the dogs used to bite and they used to dismember the Taino. The Taino were also burnt alive. And you remember we mentioned Hatui. Well, this is what happened to him. Velasquez actually authorized the burning alive of Hatui in Cuba. The Taino hanged themselves or they drank the poisonous cassava juice. They committed suicide. They also practiced infanticide because they prefer to see their children die than live under Spanish cruelty. Wow. Dogs and horses were used in the process of killing Taino for sport. Such sport included hunting them, galloping at them with a sword to see if the sword would stick them right through, like come up from the back to the front, trying to cut off a Taino head with one swing, and dropping Taino babies over cliffs and drowning them in rivers. Wow, eh? Now, as Taino men were taken to work in forced labor, their conuscos or their small farm plots were left abandoned. As a result, many Taino families starved and even died. Then the encomienda system, which was an absolute mess, killed many Taino as a result of them being overworked and being starved. Many also died under the strain of carrying heavy loads and enduring cruel beatings in the mines. And then, of course, the big one, diseases. The Spaniards brought diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. They were brought over by the Spaniards and they killed many Taino people. And then in all of this, there was the role of the Catholic Church. Now, Spain was seen as the pioneering force of carrying Roman Catholicism to the New World. Every expedition before departure even had to be blessed by the Pope. The Pope also highlighted that the colonizers had to convert the indigenous people to Christianity. Now, many of the early colonists did not have any interest in carrying out any conversions themselves. They said, no. As a matter of fact, hear what they said. That is the responsibility of the clergy. So they said, let's send them back to Spain so that they could be converted, or let's get the clergymen in here so that they could do their thing and we could just do our thing. And you see, the clergymen themselves, they did little besides probably just establishing physical church buildings. Now, the Church of the Indies began with sub-bishoprics and dioceses created across the Spanish Indies. Now, the first that started was the Diocese of Santo Domingo in the year 1511. This was then followed by establishments in Baracoa and Santiago, Cuba, in New Mexico in the United States, and of course in Lima in Peru. Now, members of the clergy were seen as being either regular clergy or secular clergy. Regular clergy or secular clergy. Regular clergy were those who made and kept vows to keep the rules of one of the 5 main orders in the Catholic Church that they would have belonged to. The orders were 1, the Franciscans, 2, the Dominicans, 3, the Carmelites, 4, the Augustinians, and 5, the Jesuits. Now, the Dominicans were seen as the most powerful and they were frequently disliked by the colonists. Now, many of these clergymen, they took on apostolic work and they went to live among the indigenous to help those to hear about the message of Christ and to also establish smaller church assemblies. Now, here's the thing. Even when the church was doing good, the nations of Portugal and Spain, the Spanish and Portuguese crown, they exploited indigenous people wherever they went for the sake of expansion. Their priority was not the religious freedom or the well-being per se of those indigenous people. The Pope already told them that that should be a priority but a lot of them, even the crown itself, didn't really make that a priority. What became a priority, though, was expansion and rapid economic growth. And of course, conversion and so on would have been somewhere in there in the mix. Now, secular clergymen frequently did not oppose such exploitation, but the Dominican order did. Now, the missionaries, they wanted to convert the indigenous people to Christianity. They wanted to save the indigenous from exploitation and extermination. They wanted to save the indigenous people so that they will have more pagan souls to convert. And of course, that according to them, would please God and the Pope. And they needed indigenous labor for the construction and maintenance of church buildings and monasteries. All right. Among those who would have tried to help the cause of the indigenous people, there are two names that stand out, and I want to introduce you to these two names. The first is a guy by the name of Antonio de Montesinos. Now, Antonio de Montesinos is most famous for a sermon that he delivered on Christmas Day, 1511. He was living in Hispaniola, and he openly attacked settlers in Hispaniola, accusing them of enslaving the indigenous people. He came out and he said, this is wrong. The settlers complained to Diego Columbus, with the case going as far as being presented before King Ferdinand in Spain. Now, Ferdinand's religious and political advisor was a guy by the name of Cardinal Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, and he was also an ally with Montesinos. So as a result, the king issued a series of laws that were called the Laws of Burgos. And those laws sought to bring a healthy definition between the colonists and the indigenous people. Now, Montesinos, he ended up not returning to the Caribbean. Jimenez de Cisneros died in 1517, and the laws themselves didn't really help the situation. Then there was another guy by the name of Bartholomew de las Casas. Now, Bartholomew came to the Caribbean with Nicolas de Ovando. He was a lawyer and a soldier who fought in the conflict with the Moors. Now, he was on an expedition with Velasquez to Cuba, and he witnessed the mistreating of the indigenous people. And that was a turning point for him. He said, no, I can't do this. So you know what he did? He became an ordained minister, possibly being the first ordained minister in the New World. And along with Jimenez, he developed a plan called Plan para la Reformación de las Indias, or the plan to convert and save the Indians. Las Casas tried to develop many plans to help the cause of the indigenous people, including 1, attracting farmers as settlers, and 2, establishing tongues for free Indians where Spaniards and Indians could work together. However, many of his plans were unsuccessful. Bartholomew became a renowned historian, writing the famous pieces Historia Apologetica, Historia de las Indias, and Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, or a brief account of the destruction of the Indies. His work influenced King Charles I, who was the successor of King Ferdinand, because King Ferdinand died in the year 1516. And his work influenced King Charles. And King Charles even did his best to institute, using the principles and the ideas of Bartholomew de las Casas, he tried his best to institute laws based off those ideas. But you see, despite limited success in implementation, Las Casas' work influenced future movements towards better treatment of indigenous people, as well as providing in-depth historical documentation on the livelihood of the indigenous people and the tragic events that unfolded, which resulted in their demise. As a matter of fact, because of the historical works of this man, we know a lot about the livelihood of the indigenous people and what happened to them as a result of the Spanish conquest. So Spain has now conquered the major land territories in the Caribbean region, or the major island territories in the Caribbean region. They would have tried to conquer the Guyanas, but they didn't really have much interest in pursuing it further, except for looking for the lost city of El Dorado, which we will take a look at in the very near future. But right now, Spain has now conquered the major island territories in the Caribbean: Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, and Trinidad. And this is where we come to the end of looking at the Spanish conquest, specifically in the Caribbean region. Now, the next thing and the next logical step, of course, for the Spanish is to dive into looking at colonization and bringing administration. But before we look at that, I want to introduce two interesting events that occurred around the same time of these conquest events. And so next time, we want to take a look at two men, and we're going to do it in 2 episodes. We want to take a look at a man by the name of Hernan Cortez and his interaction with the Aztecs. And then we're going to take a look at another interesting scenario, which we will simply call for now, the Magellan Expedition. But this has been another episode of Island Uplift's history class. I hope to see you in the next one. But for now, class dismissed.